Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat and welcome along to this video tutorial. Today we are sewing the letter L, and the letter L is from my miniature foundation paper piecing pattern. So let's have a look at that. Here it is. There are all the letters of the alphabet plus a range of additional characters that you can sew, and they're really versatile. You can use them for all sorts of different bits and pieces. Today we're doing the letter L. The letter L is a one-star pattern. It's made up of one section only, and there aren't too many different bits and pieces. So that's what we're going to sew today. So to start off with, I've got a copy of the pattern piece that I have already trimmed just outside the dotted lines. I've got my two different fabrics. I've got navy for the background, and I have got pink for the actual, the letter L itself. So to start off with, we need to start off with piece number 1, which is a background piece of fabric. So I'm just going to trim a little piece, a slightly smaller piece to deal with, to begin with. And I'm going to add a bit of glue to the back of piece number 1 on the back. And I'm going to start off by placing that centrally on that piece here. Now, if you are using a patterned fabric, I'm just making sure that's sitting nice and centrally. If you're using a pattern fabric, make sure that you are placing that piece, that very first piece, right sides down. All other subsequent pieces will be right sides facing upwards. Right, so I've placed that piece centrally on the back. It's underneath section number 1. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add on piece number 2. So I need to fold back along this line. I've pre-folded all of mine. I'm going to fold back and I'm going to trim that first seam allowance. I'm using an add 1/8 ruler, but you can use an add 1/4 for this one. It's not too, there aren't too many pieces, and there aren't too many seams. I glue the pen away. So we need a piece that's going to cover piece number 2 plus your seam allowance. So if you're using an add 1/8 ruler, you need 1/8 of an inch all the way around, or if you're using an add 1/4 ruler, you need to add 1/4 of an inch all the way around. So I'm going to take my, my piece, which is going to be pink for the letter L. I'm going to place that with right sides together, and I'm just making sure that the piece of fabric is going to cover that triangle, that square. So we take that over to my machine and pop it underneath. We're going to sew on the line between 1 and 2. My stitch length is shortened. My needle down in the right place, press the foot down, no need to back stitch. Okay, and then pop. I haven't put my iron on, so we'll just wait a little minute for that to warm up. Give that a press. Oh, press it flat, and then I'm going to flip it open against that seam line carefully and press that flat. Give a little finger press first, and then press with the iron. Okay. Oh, just dropped on the floor. So we've got piece number 1 and piece number 2. We're then going to flip over. We're going to now do piece number 3, and piece number 3 is a background piece. I'm going to fold back along that line, and then I'm going to trim this seam allowance. That will give me a nice, neat edge to start with. Get rid of those. So we need a background piece. And you can see here I'm using a larger piece, much larger than you need. I find it easier when I'm dealing with smaller pieces to start with a, smaller piecing, to start with a larger piece of fabric and just trim back. So I'm going to place that raw edges matching. Again, I'm going to take that over to the machine, and I'm going to sew on the line between 1 and 2 and piece number 3. Okay, so I've sewn along that line. I'm now going to press and flip it over. and then I'm going to trim. So now this piece number 3, it's on the outside, so I'm just going to trim along just outside the paper, and then I'm also going to trim across here as well. We can neaten up all of these edges at the end. So we've done pieces 1, 2 and 3. The next piece is piece number 4, and you can see on the pattern piece it's been shaded with little dots. See if I can bring that up to show you. You can see there are little dots to help you identify which parts are that make up the letter. So this is a nice long one, piece number 4. I'm just going to fold that again along that line, and I'm going to trim using my add an 1/8, but you could be using around 1/4. And I'm going to put that against the pink. Pick that up, come over to my machine. Flip it over. Needle down, just sew along the line. Give that a press. And press away. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, this is a 1-star rating letter, so it's not too difficult to sew. So I'm just going to trim a little bit along these sides, and then I'm going to do piece number 5 next. So I'm just going to fold back against piece number 4, the line between 4 and 5, and trim off this excess fabric. I just need to snip a little bit more there. So I'll save that for another letter. So now I've got pieces 1, 2, 3 and 4. Next one is going to be along the side here, which is a piece number 5, which is a background piece. Now we need a piece of fabric that's going to sit underneath piece number 5 and extend out, because this one's on the very edge. We need to make sure that it extends out into the seam allowance. So I'll place that on top. We can see that this fabric underneath is big enough to extend all the way through the seam allowance. Bring it over to the machine, slide it under. Okay, so I've sewn between 4 and 5. I'm now going to press that. I always like to press flat first. It just warms up the fabric, makes it a little bit easier to manipulate. Just be careful if you're doing that on an angled seam, because you don't want to stretch your fabric out of place. So we can now roughly cut the excess off. And the next piece we're going to sew is piece number 6, which goes across the top of the letter. So I'm going to fold along that line. I'm using the edge of this ruler because it's tapered, but you could use a piece of card. And if you've pre-folded, this stage is a lot easier to do, especially when you get to the little pieces. So I'm going to trim off this here, because you don't want all of this sitting inside your block. Trim these pieces away, and then we need a new piece of fabric. And again, because this one sits on the this piece sits on the very edge of the block, we need the piece that we're adding to be large enough to extend to include the 1/4 inch seam allowance for the block, both on the top and to the left and the right side. So we need a slightly bigger piece for this. But we use exactly the same method. Place it on top of the background fabric. Take it over to the machine. That's just slid, not just saying that, that's okay. And this one, we're going to sew all the way through to each side of the seam allowance. So can you see here, I've sewn, you've got the block with the solid lines, and I've sewn all the way up to the edges of the dotted lines. Press this one as well. So you can see how there's a lot of repeated processes. This is where it's really handy if you can set yourself up to have your station. Oh, beg your pardon. It's really useful to have your station, everything really close, because you're just repeating processes over and over. So this is piece number 6 here that we've just sewn this way up. So I'm just going to roughly cut around the outside here. If you're doing this method working from a larger piece and trimming off, just make sure you don't waste fabric by cutting through here or being too crazy with your cutting, because you'll see that actually there isn't too much wastage sewing in this way, cutting in this way, if you're careful with what you're doing. Right, the last piece on this one is piece number 7, which is a piece across the bottom. It's exactly the same as number 6. We need it big enough to extend the piece of fabric, big enough to extend through the seam allowance at this end and to the left and the right. I'm going to fold that back. Trim away. Gives you a nice sharp edge to work from. And we need a piece. Let's iron that one, just see if we can get it out of that. Probably not quite, because this has actually got the selvage still stuck on there, so I think I'm going to place it here. So I can see that the fabric underneath is big enough to sit underneath the paper. Across to the machine. And so again, all the way through that seam allowance to either side. Press. Oh, it's so cute. Roughly cut. There we go, it's coming together. So now what I need to do is I want to be able to trim this back, so I'm going to trim back to the dotted line on the outside, and the dotted line is the very edge of the pattern piece. So I'll take my larger acrylic ruler, place the 1/4 inch line on the solid line, and the outside edge of the ruler should sit on the dashed line. I'm using an old rotary cutter with a blade in it that I'm happy to sew through paper, cut through paper. There we go, and there is your little letter L. There we go. It's cute, isn't it? So there you go, there's the letter L, and that's how you sew that. Nice and easy, relatively quick. It's not taken very long. It's only taken just short of 15 minutes. It's super cute. Hope that's been really useful. If you'd like to get a hold of the pattern, you can have a look on my website. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I have got all the videos gradually being loaded as to how you sew each of the letters in my foundation paper piecing alphabet. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again next time. Bye.